Hi, and welcome to today's episode of Piano TV. I'm Allysia, your host, and today we are going to be talking about memory and memorization in music, in particular, muscle memory. On this channel, I've talked about memory previously, and I'll be sure to link that for you if you want to check out that video. It's an older one where I go over 4 different types of memory that I like to use as a frame of reference for learning music. We have visual memory, which is like your memory of the music, like sight reading. You have analytical memory, which is being able to see shapes and patterns and chord progressions and stuff like that in your music. We have oral memory in like the listening sense. So your memory of a like the sound of a piece of music. Could you hum the melody? That kind of thing. And then finally, you have muscle memory or like physical memory. There's different ways to think of this. And this is when you can kind of, your hand just sort of know the patterns and shapes and can do it without a lot of conscious thought. So I'm going to be drawing on some of these concepts, which you don't need to check out the previous video, but you don't necessarily need to watch that video if you don't want to. We are, like I said, going to be expanding on muscle memory. And I wanted to start with just a story about my mom. So my mom went through a full music education alongside her regular education. When she was a teenager, she got her grade 8 in music, which is pretty good. And ever since then, she's had a few pieces in her back pocket that she'll just play. She'll just like sit down and play them. Even several decades after learning these pieces. I remember growing up and hearing this one particular Bach piece fairly frequently. And she didn't really practice it. She just knew it. She had it firmly anchored in her muscle memory. And she attributes her muscle memory to the reason that she can play a piece she learned many years ago. Sorry, Mom, did I do one too many many's of that? And being able to still play it now, because she can go a year or two without playing it, and then she can still sit down and play. So the reason she can do this by her own account is that she just brute force, discipline played something over and over and over and over, and you repeat something often enough and it eventually sticks. She doesn't credit any other aspects of memory such as visual or oral or analytical. She really credits that's my kid coughing in the background. She really credits the brute force. I have an audience today, by the way, guys, just cracker eating audience right now. But anyways, she kind of took a brute force approach to things. And there's nothing wrong with that. And I think repetition is really important when you're learning music. But I want to break this idea of muscle memory down, because I know this is something that some people struggle with. So the final thing I want to say before we get into it is that this idea was suggested to me by Andrew. So thank you so much for sharing this topic. And the conversation comes from a forum post, which I can share with you guys, again, linked below. That was sort of the launching off points to create this video. So let's get started. 2 types of musical fragments. All right, so here's the basic idea. Whenever you try to memorize a musical fragment, which is just a little piece of music, it'll fall in one of 2 broad categories, and that is standard patterns and melodic phrases. So a standard pattern is anything common that you see crop up in music a lot, like solid or broken chords, scale patterns, arpeggios, stuff like that. I really like teaching chord patterns in pieces early on, right from the get-go, because as soon as you get started with standard patterns, the better. It's going to just increase your ability to look at a piece of music and see shapes and see patterns. These kinds of things, chord patterns, are really, really common. So, I mean, not just in pop music either, but in stuff like Mozart, you're going to see a lot of Alberti bass patterns, arpeggios, 1/4 dominant 7 chord patterns, stuff like that. So here's a couple examples. When we're looking at Brahms' Lullaby, which is the first one, and then House of the Rising Sun, these are just pieces I teach in Complete Piano Path. So what we'll notice with the left hand is you'll see some broad shapes. We see a broken chord pattern here, F, A, C, which is outlining an F chord, and then we have an E, B flat, C, which is outlining a C7 chord. And these broad shapes make it easier to read music, because I'm glancing at the page. I'm not reading each individual note in sort of a pure standpoint. I'm looking at it and I'm recognizing kind of a 3-note shape. Same goes for this E minor broken chord pattern in House of the Rising Sun, which switches to a G chord. Just being able to look at this and know what chord it is makes it enormously easier to read the sheet music. Now, melodies and melodic shape, on the other hand, it's a little bit different because it's highly individual. It's less about memorizing common recurrent patterns, and it's more about getting a feel for the sound of things. Chords are common among many pieces. The thing about how many pieces use the same variation of C chord over and over, but melodies are totally different from piece to piece, and differing melodies is what gives a piece its character. Now, it's easy to memorize standard patterns, like chord patterns, than it is to memorize melodic shapes. Maybe one of the reasons that my mom remembers the Bach piece so well is that the melody is filled with all kinds of standard patterns too, not just the left hand, but the right hand has scale passages and things like that. But we'll talk about this a little bit more, but the idea with memorizing melodies, it is a little bit of muscle memory, but one thing that helps you get to the points of muscle memory with it is not just analyzing, having a good analytical memory, but it's having a good ear. Can you sing the melody in addition to being able to play it? At the beginning of this video, I talked about the 4 different kinds of memory. When you are looking at a piece of music and you see some chords, or you're able to recognize chord shapes, that's your analytical memory at work. It would be really, really difficult to, and people do this, but it is really difficult to learn a piece of music when all you see on the page is just this endless smattering of notes with no rhyme or reason, just like a whole bunch of black and white dots on a page. So analytical memory is incredibly important. It kind of, once your foot's in the door, as soon as you are able to start recognizing things like chord patterns and scale shapes and things, all of a sudden your analytical memory is activated and the entire piece takes a lot more shape. And I think that this is a crucial thing to distinguish, because if you're building muscle memory, it's not just about brute force practice the way my mom talks about, although again, repetition is a part of it. You have to make sure that you have an understanding of what you're playing. If you're outlining an A minor chord, you have to understand that an A, C, and an E together form an A minor chord. It just helps the brute force aspect of it feel a little bit less like brute force. Now, when it comes to memorizing melodic shapes, it's a little bit different, because it's less about your ability to analyze structures in music, because melodies don't have the same kind of structures as, say, chord patterns or scale shapes. What you're really relying on to do this is to rely on your ear. You're really relying on your ability to remember the tune, to get the tune stuck in your head. That sort of echoic memory, where once you hear something, the sound of it sort of reverberates in your memory for a little bit. It's the ability to sing something without having the music in front of you, just the like getting the tune stuck in your head, I think is a really important gateway. So if you have a hard time, like if you're comfortable memorizing chord patterns and stuff like that, but you struggle memorizing entire pieces in which you have to memorize melodies and things like this, it's really important to develop your ear, because your ear is a huge component on just retaining melodic information. And all of this, once you have a firm analytical understanding of what you're playing and you have a tune in your ear, once you have those components, muscle memory comes from that. You can think of visual memory, like sight reading, as the very top of the tower, or the gateway. It's for many people who are learning music, it's the starting point. You look at the music and every other type of memory stems down from there. So you look at the piece of music, then you start getting the tune in your head after playing it a few times. You start building a little bit of muscle memory. You're noticing patterns and shapes, and that further reinforces said muscle memory. The further you get into the piece, the less and less that you end up relying on sight reading. Sight reading is there to get you in the door, but you don't stay in the doorway. So the more and more comfortable you get with a piece, and the more you rely on other forms of memory, the less reliant on sight reading you should then become. Understanding the structure in a piece you're learning, as well as developing your ear for the melodies and tune, is going to help you on your journey of attaining muscle memory. And accurate repetition, I want to stress the word accurate, is a really important key ingredient of this, especially if your accurate repetition is focused on really small passages, which is what we're going to talk about. All right, so let's talk about memorizing a piece. If we have sight reading way over on one side of the scale, the door, so to speak, and we have muscle memory all the way on the other side of the scale, the kind of final product of your work, then to achieve muscle memory, at some point you have to start loosening your grip on the written sheet music. The less reliant you are on the sheet music, the better your muscle memory is going to be. So I want to encourage those of you who are really, really reliant on sheets to start developing your analytic and ear sense when you're playing music in order to help you on that muscle memory journey. And I'm going to share a couple tips for that as well. So how do you reduce your reliance on sheet music of a particular piece that you're learning? First, I just want to iterate that sight reading is a really, really important skill. I don't want to brush it off like it's just this like kind of passing thing. It is the door. I mean, you can't get to the muscle memory stage of things if you never get in the door in the first place. You need those skills. And for all those people who just learn music by ear, it's important to remember that you can do that to a point, but there's only so much that you can read by, that you can do by ear. I mean, I've never met anyone who can learn a Chopin ballad by ear, for example. So your ear is only going to get you so far, and the sight reading skills are going to allow you to learn a huge complexity of pieces. Let's say you're learning a short one-page piece at a grade 1 level, like what I have up here on the screen, Minuet in A minor. This piece is maybe not in your muscle memory, and every time you play it through, you have this sort of insecure and shaky feeling. You can read the notes, but you would be doing it maybe slowly. Like if someone took the sheet music away from you, you'd be totally hopeless. Maybe you could partially whistle the melody. But anyways, if that's the state you're in with a piece like this, how do you get this piece into your muscle memory? The absolute first thing you need to do is narrow your range. It might seem impossible to memorize an entire piece, even if it's only one page. But memorizing 2 measures is totally doable for everyone. So right on the screen here, I have the opening 2 measures, and let's talk about what kind of patterns you might see here. In the first measure, I see an A minor chord in both hands. You can see the right hand outlining an E, C, A, which is just a backwards A minor broken chord, and then we have an A and a C in the left hand. So all of this is A minor. If I spent 2 minutes only playing measure 1, knowing that I'm working with an A minor chord, I would memorize the first measure easily because my analytical memory is really helping that muscle memory kick in. Now in the second measure and leading into the third, what kind of pattern can be found here? Well, first thing I note is the shape of that right hand movement. This is going to be totally like a physical muscle memory thing when you're outlining this triad with finger 4, 4, 2, 1, 5. That pinky has to reach higher and out of position, and that's kind of a unique extension. So I would just be memorizing the shape of that one note playing up. I might play that 4-note melody several times, building my oral or my ear memory by getting the tune in my head, but I'm also getting a feel for that physical motion. And then in the left hand, I'd notice a neat little pattern. I just have a scale-wise pattern walking up from D, E, F, G, basically, just a scale. By reading the music, which is the visual memory, I notice the patterns and shapes, which is the analytical memory, and getting the melody in my head, which is the oral memory. I've set myself up for that final step, tactile memory. So most of you who have been playing piano at least a year would be able to memorize this short passage I have on the screen in 5 to 10 minutes at absolute most, just by following these steps. And once you memorize the short passage, you're removing your reliance on the sheet and you're upgrading your reliance on your muscle memory. That's not to say you should put the sheet music away. By all means, leave it in front of you if you want, because people who tend to have really competent performances can have the sheet in front of them, simply serving as a reference or a memory jogger. They aren't using the sheet to read each note. Rather, they're using it to serve as a muscle memory cue. Still, even if you do keep your sheet up for most of your practice session, it is useful to put it away for at least a few minutes each day to test your muscle memory. If you're practicing and building your muscle memory, then you want to go through this process each and every day. Hey, even if you only memorize 2 measures a day, like what we have on the screen, which is very doable, you would still have memorized more than half of an entire piece in a week, which really is not that long of a time period for memorization. Let's have a quick look now at the rest of the line and see if we can identify any other patterns once we put the whole line together. One really cool thing about this piece, and not unique to this piece, this is common regardless of what you're learning, is when we look at the second half, measures 3 and 4, you'll notice it's basically exactly the same, except instead of outlining an A minor chord, now we're outlining a G major chord. And we have another walking pattern in the left hand, but this time instead of starting on a D, it's a walking pattern that starts on a C. Basically, in measures 3 and 4, everything just moves down a single step, and your finger position reflects that. So if you can memorize the shape and pattern of the first 2 measures, memorizing the shape and pattern of the next 2 measures is really easy because it's exactly the same, just everything is slightly lower. So it's really not too bad at all. Even the fingering is exactly the same. So I'm confident most people could memorize this passage within a couple practice sessions, even people who feel insecure about their memorization skills. As a final note, I want to share a salient passage from that forum post, which I think is really useful and says things in a nice way. The key is to think as little in terms of individual notes to be played as possible. Every time you can dump a group of notes into a collective shape, pattern, or progression, you're saving mental overhead for memorizing the rest of the piece. Naturally, your ability to do this will depend on your knowledge of standard patterns, so it's a good idea to devote some time to studying theory, harmony, and fundamental techniques. This will further your understanding of what you're playing and thus make memorization easier. You'll also probably find it easier to concentrate on one hand at a time so that you're consciously aware of what each hand is supposed to be doing at any point. I could not have said that better myself. The only addition that I want to make to that is don't spend too long in the hand separate playing phase. A lot of people get stuck with hand separate playing because it's a lot easier and it's more satisfying. And it is really difficult to put hands together. So there can be this tendency to avoid hands together playing, but that's the bread and butter of playing piano. You're going to be playing hands together. So it's best not to postpone that stage. However, understanding individual patterns in each hand can help you build those analytical skills, build those oral skills. So it's a thing worth considering. Anyways, I hope that you enjoyed this and that you're able to get some takeaway from it. Happy practicing all. I'll catch you in the next one.